December 15, 1944. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes region stood silent under a grey sky, the temperature hovering just below freezing. Along a narrow supply route near the Belgian town of St. Vith, Sergeant James Carter of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched behind a disabled supply truck, watching the tree line with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. The German military leadership at the time believed their surprise offensive would sweep through these undermanned American positions like a knife through butter, that the segregated units they faced would crumble at the first sign of overwhelming force. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those planners never anticipated was how desperation, ingenuity, and intimate knowledge of being underestimated could transform a supposedly inferior force into something far more dangerous than all their elite training had prepared them to face. James Carter was 26 years old, born in rural Mississippi where he had learned to hunt before he could read properly. His father had taught him patience, how to read animal behavior, how to use the environment itself as a weapon when you had nothing else. The army had given him a uniform and assigned him to a segregated tank battalion, but they had not given him the respect that white soldiers received automatically. The 761st Tank Battalion was equipped with M5 Stuart light tanks, machines that the regular armored divisions considered obsolete and inadequate. These tanks weighed only 15 tons compared to the 30-ton Sherman medium tanks, carried only a 37mm main gun instead of the 75mm weapon that could actually threaten enemy armor, and had armor plating so thin that experienced soldiers called them tin cans on tracks. Carter's crew consisted of 5 men who had been together since training at Fort Hood in Texas. There was Corporal Marcus Washington, the driver, who had worked as a mechanic in Detroit before the war and could coax performance out of engines that should have quit running months ago. Private First Class Leonard Johnson operated the radio and bow machine gun, a former teacher from Philadelphia, who could calculate trajectories and ranges in his head faster than most men, could work a slide rule. Private Robert Hayes loaded the main gun, youngest of the crew at 19 from Atlanta, with hands quick enough that he could maintain a rate of fire that impressed even skeptical white officers. And Corporal David Mitchell manned the turret machine gun, a farmer's son from North Carolina who never wasted ammunition and never missed what he aimed at. The 761st had been attached to various infantry divisions throughout the European campaign, always sent to the quiet sectors, always given the missions that regular armored units considered beneath them. They had landed at Omaha Beach 2 months after D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, where their light tanks could actually maneuver better than the heavier Shermans, pushed across France as the German forces of that era retreated toward their homeland. By December, they were exhausted, undersupplied, and still not considered real soldiers by much of the army they served. The offensive that began on December 16th caught American forces completely by surprise. Intelligence officers had dismissed the possibility of a major German operation, convinced that the enemy lacked the fuel, ammunition, and manpower for anything significant. They were catastrophically wrong. More than 400,000 German soldiers, backed by over 1,000 armored vehicles, smashed into a 75-mile front held by fewer than 90,000 American troops. The German plan called for a rapid breakthrough to the port city of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and potentially forcing a negotiated peace in the west. Carter's battalion found itself directly in the path of the 5th Armored Army, a force that included some of the most experienced units from the Eastern Front. Within the first day, American positions collapsed along multiple sectors. Units were overrun, communications broke down, and thousands of soldiers found themselves cut off behind rapidly advancing enemy columns. The 761st received orders to delay enemy advances along the St. Vith approach route, to buy time for reinforcements to arrive and establish a defensive line. It was a mission that everyone understood meant they were being sacrificed to slow down an unstoppable force. The morning of December 17th brought the first contact. Carter's platoon, consisting of 5 M5 Stuart tanks, occupied positions along a ridgeline overlooking a key crossroads. Through his binoculars, Carter watched the approach of an enemy column that made his stomach tighten with fear. The lead vehicles were Panther medium tanks, 45-ton machines with sloped armor that could deflect most American tank rounds, and a long-barreled 75mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Behind them came Tiger heavy tanks, 54-ton monsters, with 88mm guns and frontal armor so thick that even the American 76mm guns could barely scratch them at close range. Lieutenant Robert Bradford, the white officer commanding their platoon, studied the approaching force through his own binoculars from the platoon command tank. His voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled tension. "The numbers are impossible," he said. "Intelligence reported company strength, but this looks like at least a battalion, maybe more. We have orders to hold this position until nightfall, but I do not see how that is possible." Carter keyed his radio, his Mississippi accent thicker when he was thinking hard. "Lieutenant, we cannot fight them straight up," he said. "Our guns will not penetrate their frontal armor at any range where they cannot destroy us first. We need a different approach." Bradford had worked with Carter long enough to trust the sergeant's tactical instincts, even if the Army's racial policies said he should not. "What are you thinking, Carter?" "I am thinking about how my daddy used to hunt deer," Carter replied. "You do not chase a big buck through open ground. You make him come to where you are, make him think he is chasing you, lead him into terrain where his size becomes a disadvantage instead of an advantage." The platoon of 5 tanks could not stop an armored battalion in conventional combat. Their 37mm guns could not penetrate Panther frontal armor, even at point-blank range. The Stuart tank's thin armor meant that a single hit from any German tank gun would be catastrophic. But Carter understood something that the enemy commanders did not. The German armored forces of that period operated according to doctrine that emphasized speed, shock, and overwhelming firepower. Their tactics assumed that any American force they encountered would either stand and fight, allowing itself to be destroyed by superior German gunnery, or retreat in disorder, allowing itself to be overtaken and destroyed by superior German mobility. "What if we do neither?" Carter had asked Bradford during the hasty planning session. "What if we make them chase us, but control exactly where that chase goes?" The terrain around St. Vith favored this approach. The roads were narrow, winding through dense forest and steep hills. Off-road movement was nearly impossible for heavy tanks in winter conditions, with snow-concealing ditches, streams, and soft ground that could bog down even-tracked vehicles. The German column would be forced to follow the roads, unable to deploy into battle formation, vulnerable to flanking fire if it could be delivered at close enough range that even light tank guns might penetrate thinner side and rear armor. Carter proposed a tactic that sounded insane when he first explained it. One tank would position itself in clear view of the German column, engage briefly to get their attention, then withdraw rapidly down a predetermined route. The German commanders, seeing what appeared to be a lone, isolated American tank, would almost certainly pursue rather than bypass, not wanting to leave enemy forces in their rear area. The withdrawing tank would lead pursuers into a series of choke points where the other 4 Stuarts lay in ambush, positioned to fire into the sides and rears of German vehicles as they passed. Bradford listened to the plan with growing respect and growing fear. "You're talking about using yourself as bait," he said to Carter. "If they catch you before you reach the first ambush point, your tank will be destroyed in seconds. If the timing is off by even a few seconds, if they spot the ambush tanks before entering the kill zone, this entire platoon will be wiped out." Carter nodded slowly. "That is accurate, sir. But if we try to fight them any other way, we will be wiped out even faster. This way we at least have a chance, and we might take enough of them with us to actually slow their advance like we were ordered to do." The human factor in Carter's thinking went deeper than tactics. He understood psychology in ways that military manuals did not teach. The German forces of that era had been trained to view enemy soldiers through a lens of racial and military hierarchy. They would see a black American crew in an obsolete light tank and make assumptions about competence, courage, and capability. They would see what appeared to be a panicked withdrawal and interpret it as confirmation of their superiority. That contempt, that certainty of their own dominance, could be weaponized against them if Carter played his role convincingly enough. This understanding came from a lifetime of experience that white soldiers simply did not have. Carter had grown up in Mississippi during the era when Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation through violence and intimidation. He had learned early to read the assumptions that white people made about black capabilities, to recognize the patterns of underestimation that could sometimes be turned to advantage. A white man who assumed you were stupid might not notice when you were actually planning 3 steps ahead. A white man who assumed you were cowardly might not recognize strategic withdrawal until too late. The same dynamics that operated in the segregated American South also operated, Carter had observed, in military encounters with the German forces of that period. Enemy commanders who had been indoctrinated with racist ideology made predictable mistakes when facing black soldiers. They pursued too aggressively, failed to take adequate precautions, dismissed threats that they should have taken seriously. Carter had seen this pattern repeatedly during the campaign across France, had made mental notes about how enemy behavior changed when they realized they were facing the 761st versus when they encountered white armored units. Now he was preparing to exploit that pattern systematically to turn enemy racism into a tactical weapon as lethal as any gun or explosive. The plan required him to act out the role that racist ideology expected: the panicked, incompetent black soldier fleeing from superior white Germanic forces. But the panic would be calculated, the flight would be controlled, and the incompetence would be revealed as its opposite when the trap was sprung. Carter gathered his crew for a final briefing as darkness fell on December 17th. The 5 men sat in their tank, speaking quietly, their breath visible in the frigid air inside the unheated fighting compartment. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, large flakes that would help conceal their prepared positions, but would also make roads more treacherous for the high-speed withdrawals that the plan required. "Listen carefully," Carter said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the confined space. "Tomorrow we are going to do something that looks insane to anyone watching. We are going to deliberately attract the attention of an enemy force that outnumbers us badly and outguns us completely. We are going to run from them in ways that will make it look like we are panicking. And we are going to trust each other absolutely, because if any one of us makes a mistake, or if our timing is off by even seconds, we will all die." Washington, the driver, nodded slowly. He had been with Carter since basic training, had learned to trust the sergeant's tactical judgment even when it seemed to contradict common sense. "I understand what you are asking," he said. "You need me to drive fast enough to keep them chasing, but not so fast that we lose them. You need me to handle this tank like a race car while enemy shells are trying to blow us apart. I can do that, Sergeant, but I want you to know that every instinct I have will be screaming at me to go faster, to get us out of the kill zone as quick as possible." Carter appreciated the honesty. "Your instincts are going to be right in one sense," he replied. "We will be in a kill zone, and speed will keep us alive. But if we go too fast, if we break contact with the pursuing force, then this whole plan fails, and we have accomplished nothing except wasting fuel and ammunition. So you are going to have to override those survival instincts and trust that the plan will work if we execute it properly." Johnson, the radio operator and bow gunner, spoke up. "Sergeant, what happens if the Germans do not take the bait? What if they see through the deception and bypass us to continue their main advance? Then we will have failed in our mission to delay them," Carter acknowledged, "but we will still be alive and able to continue fighting. The worst case is not that they ignore us. The worst case is that they pursue but more carefully than we expect, that they send flanking forces through the forest to cut us off, that they coordinate with aircraft to spot our ambush positions. Those scenarios would mean we are caught in our own trap." Hayes, the loader, was the youngest of the crew and the most visibly nervous. "Sergeant, I have been loading this gun for 8 months now and I am fast, but tomorrow you are going to need me to be faster than I have ever been. At the ranges we are talking about, we will only get a few seconds per shot before targets move out of our firing arc. If I fumble even one round, if I load the wrong ammunition type, people die." "That is accurate," Carter agreed. "But I have watched you train and I have watched you fight. You are faster than you think you are, and under pressure you get faster still. Tomorrow, you are going to perform like you have never performed before, and you are going to surprise yourself with what you are capable of." Mitchell, the turret gunner, was the oldest member of the crew besides Carter, a farmer who had developed extraordinary patience from years of work that required waiting for the right moment to plant, to harvest, to act. "Sergeant, my machine gun is not going to destroy any tanks tomorrow. We all know that. So what exactly is my role in this plan?" "Your role," Carter explained, "is to make chaos. The enemy commanders will be trying to control their forces during the pursuit, trying to coordinate their fire, trying to make decisions about whether to continue chasing or break off. Your machine gun fire will not penetrate their armor, but it will force their commanders to button up their hatches, will reduce their visibility, will suppress any infantry support they bring forward. You will be creating friction in their decision-making process, buying us fractions of seconds that add up to the difference between success and failure." The 5 men sat silently for a moment, each processing what they had heard, each coming to terms with what they would face when morning came. They were being asked to perform a mission that violated every standard tactical doctrine they had been taught. They were being asked to use obsolete equipment against superior forces in ways that training manuals said would result in certain destruction. They were being asked to trust that their commander's unconventional thinking would keep them alive, when conventional wisdom said they were doomed. The platoon spent December 17th preparing their ambush positions. They had to select locations where the Stuart tanks could hide from aerial observation and ground reconnaissance, but could quickly move into firing positions when the moment came. They had to calculate exact timings for how long it would take Carter's tank to travel from one ambush point to the next, factoring in road conditions, likely pursuit speeds, and the need to maintain enough distance that the Germans would keep chasing, but not so much distance that they would give up the pursuit. The preparation required attention to countless details that could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Each tank needed clear fields of fire, but also concealed routes for withdrawal if the ambush was detected prematurely. The crews had to position spare ammunition at each ambush site, because running out of rounds in the middle of an engagement would be fatal. They marked routes through the forest with subtle signs that would be visible to them, but not to pursuing enemy forces, using techniques that ranged from broken branches at specific angles to small piles of stones that indicated safe passages through terrain that looked impassable. Carter walked each section of the planned route multiple times, memorizing every curve, every slope, every place where the road surface changed from packed dirt to gravel to ice. He noted trees that could provide temporary cover during withdrawal, identified spots where enemy tanks might try to take shortcuts, calculated sight lines, and dead ground with the practiced eye of someone whose life depended on understanding terrain. The winter afternoon was fading into early dusk by the time he completed his reconnaissance, his boots crunching through snow that was already beginning to freeze solid as temperatures dropped. Corporal Washington worked on Carter's tank, tuning the engine to ensure maximum reliability. The Continental radial aircraft engine that powered the Stuart was generally reliable, but it had been running hard for months with minimal maintenance. Washington adjusted timing, checked fuel lines, and replaced worn spark plugs with spares that he had traded for cigarettes. If Carter's tank broke down during the withdrawal phase, the entire plan would collapse. Private Johnson studied maps and calculated ranges. The Stuart's 37mm gun could penetrate the side armor of a Panther tank at ranges under 300 meters if the shot hit at the right angle. The rear armor was even more vulnerable, but getting into position for rear shots would require perfect timing. Johnson worked out precise firing positions for each ambush site, marking distances to likely enemy positions, noting landmarks that gunners could use to estimate range in the heat of action. Private Hayes loaded extra ammunition, organizing rounds by type. They had armor-piercing shot for engaging tanks, high-explosive rounds for softer targets, and canister rounds filled with steel balls for use against infantry at close range. Hayes arranged ammunition so that Carter could call for specific round types without delay, because in the close-range fighting they were planning, every second would matter. Corporal Mitchell inspected the Browning .30 caliber machine guns, cleaning them meticulously despite the cold that made metal stick to bare skin. Machine gun fire would not damage enemy tanks, but it could suppress infantry support, destroy optics and vision ports, and generally add to the chaos Carter wanted to create. Lieutenant Bradford coordinated with the other tank crews, ensuring everyone understood the plan and the timing. The first ambush position was located where the road passed between two steep hillsides, creating a natural choke point only about 40 meters wide. Two Stuart tanks would hide on the hillsides, concealed behind trees and brush, waiting for German vehicles to enter the kill zone before emerging to fire into their thinner side armor. The second ambush position was at a sharp curve in the road where pursuing vehicles would have to slow down. One Stuart would be positioned in a ravine overlooking the curve, able to fire down into the thinner roof armor of passing tanks. The third ambush position was the most ambitious and dangerous. It was located where the road forded a small stream with soft ground on either side that would bog down vehicles that tried to maneuver off the road surface. Two Stuarts would be hidden in the forest on opposite sides of the ford, able to engage from both flanks simultaneously, while enemy vehicles were most vulnerable. The plan required Carter to survive long enough to lead pursuers through all three ambush positions, a journey of roughly 5 kilometers that would probably take 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how aggressively the Germans pursued. During that time, he would be alone, outnumbered, with the enemy's superior speed and firepower, able to destroy his tank with a single well-aimed shot. On the morning of December 18th, German reconnaissance elements approached the crossroads. Carter's tank sat in plain view on the ridgeline, engine idling, turret traversing slowly as if searching for targets. The psychological warfare began immediately. By positioning his obsolete light tank where it could be easily seen, Carter was sending a message that appeared to be one of incompetence or desperation, a lone American crew that did not understand how badly overmatched it was. The German reconnaissance halted, called up their main column. Through his periscope, Carter watched Panthers and Tigers deploy from march formation into attack formation, exactly as he had hoped they would. The enemy commanders were not going to bypass or ignore his tank. They were going to eliminate it, teach these Americans a lesson about challenging superior German armor. Carter spoke calmly into his radio. "Washington, start moving us back down the road as soon as I fire the first shot. Johnson, I need one round high explosive toward their lead elements, not trying to damage anything, just getting their attention. Hayes, stand by for rapid fire once we start the withdrawal. Mitchell, use the machine gun to make us look desperate." The lead German vehicles came within 800 meters. At this range, their guns could destroy Carter's Stuart easily, while his 37mm gun had virtually no chance of penetrating their frontal armor. Carter waited, letting them close to 600 meters, making them confident. Then he gave the order to fire. Johnson's high-explosive round burst against the frontal armor of the lead Panther, creating a spectacular flash and cloud of smoke, but causing no real damage. It was exactly what Carter wanted, a demonstration of American presence that posed no actual threat, confirming German assumptions about the ineffectiveness of light tank weapons. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple tanks fired simultaneously, their rounds screaming past Carter's position or impacting the ridgeline in eruptions of frozen earth and shattered trees. Washington already had the Stuart moving backward, engine roaring as the light tank reversed down the slope at a speed that seemed reckless. Mitchell opened up with the turret machine gun, firing long bursts in the general direction of the German column, bullets sparking harmlessly off thick armor. The machine gun fire served its purpose. It made Carter's tank look panicked, desperate, exactly like a crew that had just realized how badly they had miscalculated their position. Carter watched through his periscope as German commanders made their decision. Instead of bypassing his position and continuing their advance towards Sankt Vith, they committed forces to pursue and destroy this impudent American tank. At least 4 Panthers and 2 Tigers detached from the main column, accelerating down the road after Carter's withdrawing Stuart. The chase had begun. Washington drove with controlled recklessness, pushing the Stuart to its maximum road speed of roughly 58 kilometers per hour on the icy road. The heavier German tanks could not match that speed on the winding route, but they were fast across country, and their gunners were experienced veterans. Shells continued to crack past Carter's tank, close enough that the pressure waves rocked the light vehicle. Carter counted seconds in his head, timing the withdrawal. Too fast and the Germans might give up the chase. Too slow and they would get lucky with a hit. He called minor course corrections to Washington. keeping them visible to pursuers but never giving them a stationary target. Hayes fed ammunition into the main gun, while Johnson occasionally fired backward at their pursuers, shots that had no chance of causing damage but maintained the appearance of desperate resistance. 3 kilometers into the chase, Carter's tank approached the first ambush position. He could see the narrow gap between the hillsides ahead, knew that his concealed platoon mates were somewhere in the forest, watching his approach. The timing had to be perfect. If he entered the kill zone too far ahead of his pursuers, they might spot the ambush tanks before entering. If he entered too close, the ambush tanks might hit Carter instead of the enemy. "Washington, slow down," Carter ordered. "Let them close up a bit. Make them think they are about to catch us." The driver eased back on the throttle, allowing their pursuers to close the gap to less than 200 meters. Carter could see individual details now, the markings on the lead Panther, the commander visible in his open hatch, the way the tank's long gun remained trained on his Stuart, even while moving at speed. Carter's tank entered the choke point. He counted to 3, then keyed his radio. "Now," he said simply. 2 Stuart tanks burst from their concealed positions on the hillsides, engines screaming as they charged down slopes that seemed too steep for tracked vehicles. They were less than 100 meters from the sides of the pursuing Panthers when they fired. At this range, even the Stuart's modest gun could penetrate Panther side armor. The lead Panther shuddered as an armor-piercing round struck its right side near the turret ring. The hit did not cause an immediate catastrophic failure, but it penetrated through to the crew compartment. The Panther lurched to a halt, thick smoke beginning to pour from hatches as the crew bailed out. The second Panther tried to traverse its turret toward the unexpected threat on the hillside, but tank turrets traverse slowly, and the commander had to decide whether to engage the ambush tanks on the hills or continue pursuing Carter's withdrawing Stuart. That moment of hesitation proved fatal. A second Stuart fired, its round punching through the Panther's rear deck armor where the engine was located. Flames erupted immediately, the intense heat cooking off stored ammunition in a series of secondary explosions. The following Tiger was too massive and slow to take evasive action in the narrow defile. It attempted to reverse back out of the kill zone, but backing a 54-ton tank at speed on a narrow road required skill and time. A third armor-piercing round struck its side, penetrating the fighting compartment. The Tiger continued to back up despite the hit, its thick armor preventing the kind of catastrophic damage that had destroyed the Panthers. But smoke indicated internal fires, and the turret was no longer moving. Carter did not wait to assess damage. His role was to keep moving, to keep the surviving enemy vehicles pursuing him toward the next ambush, rather than stopping to engage the tanks that had just struck from the hillsides. Washington accelerated again, racing through the choke point and around a curve that put terrain between them and their pursuers. Behind them, the German column had lost 3 vehicles in less than 30 seconds. Commanders radioed urgent reports, describing what had appeared to be a trap, but might just be additional scattered American forces. The response from higher headquarters was unequivocal. Continue pursuit, eliminate all enemy resistance, maintain the pace of advance. The offensive's tight schedule allowed no time for caution. The remaining German vehicles, now including additional Panthers, called up from the main column, continued their pursuit. If anything, the ambush had made them more determined rather than more cautious. German doctrine emphasized aggressive action, maintaining momentum, refusing to be deterred by casualties. They would hunt down and destroy these American tanks that dared to resist. Carter's crew felt a mixture of elation and terror as they raced toward the second ambush position. They had actually damaged German tanks, proven that their supposedly obsolete Stuart could hurt the enemy's elite armor if positioned correctly and commanded with skill. But they were still alone, still fleeing from forces that could destroy them in seconds if the pursuit got too close. The second ambush position approached, the sharp curve where one Stuart waited in the ravine. Carter could see fresh pursuit closing behind them, at least 5 Panthers now, their commanders likely furious about the losses at the first ambush and determined not to be fooled again. The curve forced Washington to slow down, the Stuart's track slipping on ice as they skidded around the turn. Behind them, German tanks also slowed, their gunners stabilizing for shots. A round cracked past Carter's turret, so close that paint was scored from the armor by the shell's passage. The Stuart in the ravine held its fire as Carter's tank completed the turn, waiting for pursuers to commit to the curve. The lead Panther came around the turn at reduced speed, and that was when the ambush tank fired from above. The round struck downward into the Panther's thin roof armor, penetrating straight down through the turret and into the hull. The Panther stopped immediately, crew hatches flying open as men scrambled to escape. But this time the German column did not bunch up in confusion. The following Panthers spread out, some going off-road despite the difficult terrain, trying to surround the ambush position. The Stuart in the ravine destroyed another Panther with a shot into its side as it attempted to climb the hillside. But then German return fire began to concentrate on the ravine position. Carter heard Lieutenant Bradford's voice on the radio, calm despite the circumstances. Ambush 2 is withdrawing, took some hits but still mobile, heading to fallback position. Carter, you need to get to ambush 3 fast. We have multiple enemy vehicles bypassing the curve and trying to cut you off cross-country. Washington pushed the Stuart harder, the engine's roar becoming a scream as the driver demanded performance that the worn machine was barely capable of delivering. They were 4 kilometers into their fighting withdrawal now, with another kilometer to go before reaching the third and final ambush position at the stream ford. The terrain opened up briefly, giving Carter a view of the broader tactical situation, and what he saw made his throat tighten. The German column was not just pursuing with the initial force. They had committed substantial resources to running down his small platoon, perhaps recognizing that these particular Americans were more dangerous than expected, perhaps simply determined to eliminate resistance before continuing their advance. Carter counted at least 8 Panthers still in pursuit, plus 2 Tigers that had fallen behind on the winding roads but were still following. The ambush tactics had destroyed or disabled 4 enemy vehicles, but Carter's platoon of 5 Stuarts was now scattered across several kilometers of forest road, each tank isolated and vulnerable. The stream ford came into view, the water flowing dark and cold between banks covered in snow. This was the position where Carter had to make his final stand work, or watch his entire platoon be destroyed. 2 Stuarts were hidden in the forest on opposite sides of the ford, positioned to create a deadly crossfire. But the Germans would be wary now, expecting ambush, their commanders alert for signs of additional American forces. Carter made a decision that went beyond the original plan. Instead of leading pursuers into the ambush and continuing through, he would stay at the ford, adding his tank's firepower to the ambush, turning this into a decisive engagement rather than another hit-and-run strike. It was riskier, surrendering the mobility that had kept him alive, but it offered the chance to inflict enough damage that the German column might actually be forced to halt and regroup. "Washington," he said, "bring us to a stop on the near side of the ford, angle us so we have a good shot at anything trying to cross. We are done running." The driver executed the maneuver smoothly, positioning the Stuart behind a low rise that provided partial hull-down cover. Hayes loaded an armor-piercing round, while Johnson calculated ranges to likely enemy approach routes. Mitchell test-fired his machine gun in a short burst, confirming function. The pursuing Panthers appeared through the trees, moving more cautiously now, but still advancing. The lead tank reached the stream bank, paused while its commander assessed the ford. Carter could see the calculation happening. The water looked shallow, the ford appeared to be solid ground, and the pursuing American tank sat visible on the far side, seemingly trapped by terrain and exhausted from flight. The Panther committed to the crossing. Its driver eased the 45-ton vehicle into the water, tracks throwing up spray as they churned through the ford. The tank was at its most vulnerable now, unable to maneuver quickly, its lower hull exposed. Carter gave the command and his gunner fired, joined simultaneously by the 2 hidden Stuarts. 3 armor-piercing rounds converged on the crossing Panther from 3 different angles. At least 2 penetrated, striking the thinner lower hull armor. The Panther shuddered, its engine note changing from a healthy roar to a laboring cough. It tried to complete the crossing, but the damaged drivetrain failed halfway through, leaving the 45-ton vehicle stuck in the middle of the stream, blocking the ford. The following Panthers halted in confusion. Their route was blocked by their own disabled vehicle, and now they were taking fire from multiple positions. One attempted to bypass the ford by going downstream, but the soft ground that Carter had counted on immediately bogged down its tracks. The heavy tank settled into mud up to its hull, helpless. Another Panther tried to engage Carter's visible position, but the partial cover provided by the rise meant its gunner could not get a clear shot at Carter's hull. The Panther's round sparked off the rise just below Carter's tank, showering the Stuart with frozen earth and rock fragments. Hayes loaded and fired again, his round striking the enemy tank's gun mantlet, not penetrating but damaging the weapon's external mechanism enough that it would not elevate properly. The battle at the stream ford became a chaotic close-range brawl that lasted nearly 20 minutes. German tanks attempted to find crossing points or positions from which they could bring effective fire on the American positions. The Stuart tanks shifted positions constantly, firing and moving before return fire could be accurately directed. The thick forest and rough terrain that had channeled the German column now prevented them from bringing their numerical superiority to bear effectively. Private Hayes performed magnificently, loading and firing with mechanical precision despite the thunder of incoming rounds and the acrid smoke that filled the fighting compartment. Corporal Johnson served as Carter's eyes, calling out targets and ranges, even while operating the bow machine gun to suppress German infantry that attempted to approach on foot. Corporal Washington kept the engine running smoothly, maneuvering the Stuart through impossible terrain with a driver's instinct for what the vehicle could handle. Corporal Mitchell's machine gun fire, while not damaging enemy tanks, struck optics and vision ports, forcing German commanders to button up their hatches, reducing their situational awareness. The tide turned when Lieutenant Bradford's tank arrived from its fallback position, approaching the ford from an unexpected angle. Bradford had circled through the forest, using his map knowledge and his radio operator's skill to navigate without roads. His Stuart emerged from dense trees directly behind the German formation, firing into the rear armor of a Panther that was focused on engaging Carter's position. The range was less than 50 meters, close enough that the Stuart's gun punched through with devastating effect. The German column finally broke. After losing 3 more vehicles at the ford, and with their advance completely stalled, the remaining Panthers withdrew. They pulled back in good order, maintaining fire discipline, but they withdrew nonetheless. For the first time in the offensive, a German armored column had been stopped cold by a supposedly inferior American force. Carter's crew sat in their tank for several minutes after the engagement ended, breathing hard, hands shaking from adrenaline. The Stuart's interior was thick with gun smoke and the smell of hot metal. Spent shell casings covered the floor. The radio crackled with check-ins as the platoon accounted for survivors. Miraculously, all 5 Stuart tanks were still operational, though everyone had taken damage. Carter's tank had scored paint off its turret from near misses, a damaged antenna, and several holes in the thin hull armor that had somehow not penetrated to the crew compartment. The tank that had ambushed from the ravine had taken a round through its engine deck that destroyed the cooling system but left the engine itself functional for limited operation. Another Stuart had thrown a track during a high-speed maneuver, but the crew had repaired it, using tools and spare parts carried for exactly that purpose. Against this, they had destroyed or disabled at least 11 enemy tanks, significantly delayed the German advance on St. Vith, and forced the enemy to commit additional forces to clearing what should have been a minor obstacle. Lieutenant Bradford brought the platoon together in a small clearing near the ford. The white officer looked at his black tank crews with an expression that mixed respect, amazement, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding about the injustice of the Army's racial policies. "Carter," Bradford said, "that was the most audacious, brilliant, insane tank operation I have ever witnessed or participated in. You led an elite German armored force into a trap using tactics that no manual teaches and weapons that everyone considers obsolete. You turned a suicide mission into a victory." Carter shrugged, his Mississippi accent soft. "We did what needed doing, sir. Used what we had, used what we knew. My daddy always said that being underestimated is the best advantage you can have when you are hunting something bigger and meaner than you are." Over the following days, the battle at the stream ford became somewhat legendary within the segregated units, fighting in the Ardennes. Other black tank crews requested details about the tactics Carter had employed. White officers who had previously dismissed these units began paying attention to their capabilities. The 761st Tank Battalion received recognition for their actions, though that recognition was often qualified by surprise that black soldiers could perform so effectively in combat. The broader offensive continued for weeks, eventually becoming known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in World War II. The German advance was ultimately halted not at Sankt Vith, but at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division held out against overwhelming odds until relief arrived. But the delay caused by units like Carter's platoon was part of the cumulative friction that slowed the German timetable, bought time for reinforcements to arrive, allowed the Allied command to organize an effective response. Carter's innovation with bait tactics spread beyond his immediate unit. Other American commanders facing superior enemy armor began employing similar methods, using mobility and terrain to offset firepower disadvantages, exploiting enemy assumptions about American fighting spirit and competence, turning pursuit into opportunity for ambush. The tactics were particularly effective when employed by units that the enemy underestimated, because that underestimation caused German commanders to commit forces aggressively rather than cautiously. In the weeks after the engagement at the stream ford, the 761st Tank Battalion continued fighting through the Ardennes, through the Rhineland, and eventually into Germany itself. They were never given the recognition or resources provided to white armored units, but they developed a reputation among those who actually paid attention as among the most effective light tank units in the European theater. Sergeant James Carter survived the war and returned to Mississippi in 1945. He found that defeating elite enemy armor in Europe did not translate to respect or equality in the segregated American South. He could not vote in many jurisdictions, despite having risked his life to defend democracy. He faced discrimination in employment, housing, and basic human dignity. The same country that had sent him to fight tyranny abroad enforced racial tyranny at home. But Carter carried something with him that could not be taken away by unjust laws or social customs. He knew what he was capable of when given the chance. He knew that he had outthought, outfought, and outmaneuvered enemy forces that were supposed to be superior in every measurable way. He knew that the limitations placed on black Americans by white society were artificial, maintained by power rather than proven by performance. The men who had served under Carter's command during that desperate December battle carried similar knowledge. Corporal Marcus Washington became an advocate for civil rights, using his mechanical skills to keep vehicles running for organizing efforts in Detroit. Private Leonard Johnson returned to teaching, but now he taught his students that they were capable of anything regardless of what society told them. Private Robert Hayes used the GI Bill despite discriminatory application of its benefits to get an education, eventually becoming an engineer. Corporal David Mitchell returned to farming, but he raised his children with the certainty that they deserved every opportunity that white children received. The tactical innovations that Carter developed out of necessity at the stream ford eventually were incorporated into formal American doctrine for light armor operations. The techniques of using mobility to offset firepower disadvantages, of turning pursuit into ambush, of exploiting terrain to create situations where lighter vehicles could engage heavier ones effectively, these became standard teaching. Often this knowledge transfer happened without acknowledgement of who had pioneered the tactics or under what circumstances they had been developed. The 761st Tank Battalion was deactivated in 1945. Its personnel dispersed to other units or discharged from service. For decades, their contributions to the victory in Europe received minimal recognition in historical accounts that focused on white units and white heroes. The institutional racism that had segregated them during the war continued to marginalize them in historical memory after the war. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that historians began seriously documenting the contributions of black soldiers in World War II. Researchers discovered after-action reports, personal diaries, and official records that told a story very different from the one that mainstream historical narrative had presented. They found accounts of black units performing with exceptional skill and courage, of tactical innovations developed by soldiers whom the Army's own policies said were unsuited for combat leadership. The story of Carter's engagement at the stream ford emerged from this research. pieced together from German unit records that documented the unexpected American resistance near St. Vith, from American after-action reports filed by Lieutenant Bradford, from letters that Carter had written to his family, describing the battle in careful terms that would pass military censors. The full picture revealed an engagement that was tactically significant, not just for the immediate results, but for what it demonstrated about the potential that was being wasted by racial discrimination. In 2001, the United States Army conducted a review of its historical records to identify soldiers from World War II whose contributions had been overlooked due to racial bias. The review process was complicated and incomplete, hampered by destroyed records, institutional resistance, and the simple fact that many of the soldiers in question had died in the decades since the war. But the process did result in some long-delayed recognition. Sergeant James Carter received a posthumous Silver Star for his actions during the engagement at the Stream Ford. The citation praised his tactical innovation, his courage under fire, and his leadership of the ambush operation that destroyed or disabled 11 enemy armored vehicles. The medal was presented to his daughter during a ceremony at Fort Benning, Georgia, 56 years after the battle it commemorated. The other members of Carter's crew received Bronze Stars for their roles in the engagement. Lieutenant Robert Bradford, who had trusted Carter's tactical judgment despite the racial prejudices of the era and had supported the unconventional plan, received no additional recognition, having already been decorated for his service during the war. The tactical lesson that emerged from Carter's innovation transcended the specific circumstances of one battle in the Ardennes winter. It demonstrated that military effectiveness comes not from following doctrine rigidly, but from understanding principles deeply enough to adapt them creatively. Carter understood that he could not match enemy firepower directly, so he created conditions where firepower mattered less than positioning, timing, and psychology. He understood that being underestimated was itself a tactical advantage if leveraged properly. This lesson applied beyond military tactics to the broader struggle for civil rights and equality. The same society that underestimated black soldiers in combat underestimated black citizens in civilian life, assuming limitations that did not exist, enforcing restrictions that served power rather than any legitimate social purpose. The soldiers who returned from World War II, having proven their capabilities in the most demanding circumstances, became leaders in the civil rights movement that would eventually, gradually, begin to dismantle those restrictions. The connection between military service and civil rights activism was not coincidental or merely symbolic. The men who had commanded tanks under fire, who had made life-and-death decisions in seconds, who had outthought enemy commanders, despite receiving inferior training and equipment, these men were not going to accept second-class citizenship quietly when they returned home. Their military service had given them confidence in their own capabilities, connections to other veterans with similar experiences, and a moral authority to challenge American hypocrisy that was difficult for even segregationists to dismiss entirely. Carter's grandson, Marcus Carter Johnson, named after both his grandfather and Corporal Marcus Washington, who had served as his grandfather's driver, eventually became a historian specializing in African American military history. He spent years researching not just his grandfather's specific actions, but the broader context of black soldiers' experiences in World War II. His doctoral dissertation, published as a book in 2010, examined how tactical innovation emerged from marginalized units that were forced by necessity to develop unconventional approaches since conventional resources were denied to them. The research revealed patterns across multiple theaters and multiple wars. Units that faced material disadvantages and social discrimination often developed tactical innovations that later became standard practice. Necessity truly was the mother of invention, but so was the freedom that came from being ignored by higher headquarters that did not expect much from supposedly inferior troops. Black tank units, black infantry units, black artillery units all developed techniques and approaches that white units later adopted, often without acknowledgement of their origins. The psychological dimension that Carter had understood so well, the weaponization of enemy contempt, appeared repeatedly in these accounts. German forces during World War II, Japanese forces in the Pacific, later enemy forces in Korea and Vietnam, All made similar mistakes when they encountered black American soldiers. They assumed incompetence based on racist ideology that was remarkably consistent across different cultures. That assumption led to tactical errors, pursuing too aggressively, underestimating defensive capabilities, failing to take precautions that would have been automatic when facing white American units. What emerged from this research was not just a more complete historical record, but a more complex understanding of how military effectiveness actually works. The official history had presented American victory as the result of industrial capacity, technological superiority, and proper doctrine executed by well-trained soldiers. All of that was true but incomplete. Victory also came from improvisation by soldiers whose circumstances forced them to think differently, from tactical innovation born of necessity, from the determination of men fighting not just against external enemies, but against their own country's discrimination. The Streamford engagement became a teaching case at the United States Army Armor School, where officers studying light cavalry operations analyzed Carter's tactics in detail. The instructors, most of whom were white, most of whom had never experienced the kind of discrimination that Carter faced, taught the tactical lessons without always acknowledging the broader context. But the lessons were being taught, the innovations were being preserved and transmitted, even if the full story of their origins remained partially obscured. The M5 Stuart light tank that Carter had commanded during the December engagement survived the war and eventually was shipped back to the United States. It passed through various hands, eventually ending up as a static display at a military vehicle museum in Texas. Researchers who examined the vehicle decades later found evidence of its combat history: the repaired holes in the hull armor, the scored paint on the turret, modifications to the engine that matched Corporal Washington's described improvements. The physical artifact confirmed the documentary record, providing tangible connection to events that some skeptics had questioned. Modern analysis using computer simulation has modeled the Streamford engagement, testing whether the tactics Carter employed could actually have achieved the results reported in historical records. The simulations confirmed that under the specific terrain and tactical conditions present that December day, a properly executed ambush by light tanks against heavier vehicles trapped in restrictive terrain could indeed have produced the reported casualty ratios. The analysis also confirmed how narrow the margins were, how small variations in timing or positioning would have resulted in the complete destruction of Carter's platoon. This analysis revealed something that Carter himself probably understood instinctively. He had operated in a tactical space where conventional wisdom said his mission was impossible, but careful exploitation of terrain, timing, and enemy psychology made success achievable if everything was executed almost perfectly. He had taken calculated risks that looked insane from the outside, but were actually the safest available option, given the alternatives. He had trusted his crew to perform under pressure, and they had justified that trust. The relationship between the 5 men in Carter's tank during that engagement represented something that the segregated army officially denied could exist: a cohesive, effective combat team whose members trusted each other absolutely, who functioned together with the kind of seamless coordination that only comes from shared experience and mutual respect. The Army's racial policies assumed that black soldiers required white officers to function, that black units would collapse under pressure, that combat effectiveness required racial homogeneity. Carter's crew disproved all of those assumptions simply by doing their jobs under circumstances that would have broken many supposedly superior units. In the broader sweep of World War II history, the engagement at the Streamford was a minor tactical action, one of thousands fought during the Ardennes offensive, probably not even noticed by the senior commanders planning operations at the strategic level. But minor tactical actions accumulate into operational effects. Operational effects accumulate into strategic outcomes. The delay Carter's platoon imposed on the German advance was small, but small delays across many locations added up to the stalled offensive that ultimately failed. The story's significance extended beyond its immediate military impact to what it revealed about human potential and social injustice. Here was clear evidence that the racial hierarchy enforced by American law and custom was not based on actual differences in capability, but on power and tradition. When given opportunity and necessity, black soldiers proved capable of anything that white soldiers could achieve. The only real differences were in the opportunities provided and the recognition awarded. This reality created cognitive dissonance for many white Americans who witnessed black soldiers' combat effectiveness during World War II. Some responded by beginning to question the racial assumptions they had been taught. Others responded by inventing explanations that preserved their prejudices, attributing black soldiers' success to white officers' leadership, claiming that combat was different from civilian life in ways that made racial integration acceptable in one context but not the other, simply ignoring evidence that contradicted their beliefs. But cognitive dissonance, once created, tends to grow rather than resolve in favor of prejudice when the evidence keeps accumulating. More and more white Americans who served alongside black soldiers in World War II came home with first-hand experience that contradicted segregationist ideology. They became at least potential allies in the civil rights movement that accelerated after the war, even if many of them remained conflicted about the issue. The long-term impact of World War II service on racial attitudes in America was complex and contradictory. The war did not end segregation or solve racial discrimination, but it created conditions that made the eventual civil rights movement more possible. Veterans like Carter and his crew knew what they were capable of and refused to accept artificial limitations. White veterans who had witnessed black soldiers' effectiveness found it harder to maintain absolute belief in racial hierarchy. The gap between American rhetoric about freedom and democracy and American reality regarding racial justice became increasingly difficult to ignore or defend. Carter himself, in interviews conducted late in his life by his grandson and other researchers, was characteristically modest about his role in these broader historical forces. He insisted that he had simply done his job to the best of his ability under difficult circumstances, that any competent soldier would have done the same, that the credit belonged to his crew and the other tankers who had executed the plan with him. But when pressed about whether he thought his military service had contributed to advancing civil rights, Carter acknowledged that it had given him and others like him proof that could not be denied. "We showed that we could do anything they could do," he said in one recorded interview from 1998. "Could not argue with us anymore about whether we were capable, whether we were brave, whether we were smart. We proved it where it counted, in combat." After that, all their reasons for keeping us separate were shown to be lies. The 5 men who had fought together in that Stuart tank remained friends throughout their lives, despite being scattered across the country after the war. They gathered for reunions every few years, sharing memories and maintaining the bonds forged in combat. At these gatherings, they would inevitably return to discussing the December day when they had stopped a German armored column with nothing but light tank skill and audacity. In their later years, these reunions gained additional attendees: children, grandchildren, other veterans who wanted to meet the men from the 761st, historians researching the period. The stories were preserved, recorded, passed down. The tactical details were analyzed by military professionals. The human dimensions were captured by family members who understood that their relatives had been part of something historically significant. When Sergeant James Carter died in 2003 at the age of 85, his funeral in Mississippi was attended by over 300 people, including several retired Army generals, historians, civil rights activists, and veterans from multiple wars. The eulogy was delivered by his grandson, who spoke about a man who had fought 2 wars, one against tyranny abroad, one against injustice at home, and who had approached both with the same intelligence, courage, and determination that had characterized his actions at the stream ford in December 1944. The other crew members preceded or followed Carter in death over the following decade, each receiving recognition that would have seemed impossible when they had first put on their uniforms in the segregated army of the 1940s. Their obituaries ran in national newspapers. Their service was acknowledged in ways that would not have happened a generation earlier. The country was slowly, incompletely, beginning to acknowledge debts that should have been paid decades before. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.